Welcome to Rick's workshop. Today we're going to show you how to make this folding hammock stand. It just takes some 2x4s and a little bit of patience, but follow along and you should be able to get it just right. We start with a simple drawing, something that gives the basic layout. You can see here I've drawn up the base, both from the front view and from the top view, so I understand where to lay out all the pieces. Next, let's see some 2x4s. Here they are, ready for our bit of work. We're going to start by cutting out the legs and the uprights. So to the saw we go. So I set up a stop at 42 inches on my power miter box. I'm going to be cutting 8 pieces this length with 2x4. So it's a good idea to set up a stop. All I got to do is put the 2x4 in, start the saw, and gently cut. Alright, 7 more to go. With all our boards cut, it's time to set up a template so that we can round over the ends of the 2x4s and get some smooth transitions. Using a compass, a square, and a pencil, I'm going to show you how to lay out a circle at the end of this board. First, draw a square line. Then, using your compass, we're going to bisect that line. This is high school geometry, but I think you'll get it. I set it to one side, being careful to make sure that I get the edge just right. And I draw a half circle. Then I go to the other side and repeat again. Again, trying to get as close to the edge as I can. Now, using the edge of my square, I'll draw a line across those 2 points. With that line drawn, I'll now take my compass, set it to the center point, adjust the width, and then draw my circle. Next, let's cut that out with a jigsaw and refine the shape. With my piece clamped down to the table, take my jigsaw and start following along the line. Again, I don't want to go into the line, I want to just stay outside of it because later I'll use some sandpaper. Halfway through the cut, I reverse sides and cut from the other end so that it makes it a little easier to get to that line. Just take your time, be patient. After cutting out with the jigsaw, I wrap some sandpaper around a block of wood. I'm going to use this to refine the shape. I'm not interested in getting a perfect curve, but something that's smooth, so that when I run a router over it, I get a nice smooth curve on our 2x4s. So I refined the shape with some sandpaper. I went ahead and took my drill and made a hole in the center of the circle on our jig. It's going to get used with a nail to hold it in place while we route everything out, and that nail hole will then be used to make the bolt holes later. Here it is, our template. First, scribe a line on the 2x4, and then cut it out with a jigsaw. Now with the piece clamped in place, I'm going to take my jigsaw and do the same thing that I did with the template. I'm going to cut out the piece following that line. I mounted a pattern following bit on my router, have the router unplugged, and you can see there's a ball bearing here. That ball bearing is going to ride along on the template that we created earlier, smoothing out that cut. With a piece clamped to the table, we're going to go ahead and use the router. I started doing a little bit of cutting. All it takes is pushing it into the guide, and that bearing will just follow along on that smooth curve. With all the pieces cut, I've lowered the bit on the router, and now I'm going to clean up that bottom half of all the cuts. As before, start the router, slowly engage, and have the bearing follow along on the first pass. At the very end of this clip, I get a little bit of tear out on the 2x4. I fix that later with a little bit of sanding. With all the pieces routed out, I decided to lay them out on the floor so I can figure out what everything looks like and see if there's anything missing. And sure enough there is. I gotta make some spacers. So let's move over to the drill press where I've set up my hole saw and I can cut out those spacers. I use a hole saw because it makes a nice round circle and it pre-drills the hole in the center, but it takes a while. So let's skip ahead. With the hole complete, I wait for the drill press to stop. I'll then use a flathead screwdriver to pop out the piece. The piece will have a hole drilled out in the center, which is perfect because we're going to use that as a guide for our bolt hole. Back to the layout. I've cut out all of the spacers and put them in place, and you can see where they sit. Later I'll show you how that gap is used. Down here on the other end I laid out a bolt so you can see where that goes, and now all those holes we drilled out earlier and put the nail in, they'll come in real handy. Before I can go ahead and make all those bolt holes, I took everything back to the drill press and I'm going to make some recesses for the nuts and washers. Using my Forstner bit, a little larger than the washer itself, I'll go ahead and set a line where the approximate depth would be, so that the washer and the nut sit flush below the surface. With that line set, I go ahead and set the drill press. And once that's done, I go ahead and do a test cut. Gotta make sure everything fits properly. I just sped the video up a little bit. And now, let's see what it looks like. Clear out the dust, put the washer and nut in place, and make sure that we're nice and flush. Now I gotta drill all those holes. So I'm gonna go back to the mock-up where everything's laid out, and I'm gonna use some blue chalk. Chalk's really good because it sands away easy, to just put some X's as to where I want to drill everything out. This way I won't make any mistakes and won't have some extra holes and some embarrassments later. Remember that little nail hole we made when we were setting the template? Well, here's where it comes in handy. I'm using it to figure out where the Forstner bit goes in. Quickly drill that out. I mean quick. This is fine, pretty soft, so I can get to it really quickly. Forstner bit leaves a nice flat bottom, and it also gives us a nice little divot hole in the center. We're going to use that sucker later, because that's where we're going to drill out the hole for this bolt. And here we are. We're going to use that little pinhole left by the Forstner bit to guide our drill. Make a slot for our carriage bolt. Alright, it's time for some assembly. We're going to take our bolt, put it through one side of the upright. You notice the bolt has a little square end on it. That's so that it won't spin in the slot, and when we tighten the nut down, it'll come in. We got our spacer. You saw how we cut those out with the hole saw. Slide that in, slide it into the other side. We're going to flip it over. And now we got a spot for our washer and for our nut. With that end of the upright set, we are going to attach it now to the base. We're going to introduce our longer bolt on the right side. Here we are. Now you're going to notice that I'm going to put washers in between here. This is just to create a little bit of spacing between the pieces. After all, we want them to be able to swing, and as they rotate, if I don't have that washer there, it's going to get really tight. So we'll slide that in. We'll put in the center block. No washer needed here since there's no rotation there. Pass that through. Oh, it's sticking a little bit. There we go. We'll add a washer. Add our last washer and put in our nut. And now you can see the pieces all together, and you'll notice the two holes for the legs. Notice they're offset, they're not next to each other. That's important because when we assemble it, we don't want those on top of each other. Remember how I said that bolt would get pulled in? I use an impact driver with a deep socket, and there it goes. It gets cinched up. Now it won't spin any longer. And that assembles one end of our stand. But our bolt's a little long, but that's okay. We'll go back, we'll mark it, and then we'll trim it. With the base set on the ground, we're going to go ahead and attach the legs. Same as before, we slide the piece in. There's a washer already in there. The spacer, we add a washer to the end. Our nut, and then using our impact driver, we're going to cinch that sucker right up. Okay, now we got to do the diagonals that go here. So I've temporarily set up this hammock to give us some spacing. And now our diagonals are special because they have to be able to fold into the uprights. Remember, this is a folding stand, so we want them to fit in there. So we're going to do a little bit of calculation. We're going to set some pieces in place. and see what it all looks like. After a little bit of experimentation, I came up with a dimension for those angles and went ahead and cut them up and set them inside the uprights so they fit. Later in the drawing, I'll show you how long those are. Now let's drill out for the holes. I went ahead and marked for the diagonals, used my Forstner bit to make a hole for the washer and nut, and now with the two pieces of the upright clamped together, I'm going to go ahead and drill through for the bolt. Once I got that done, I'm going to go ahead and grab the diagonals and drill holes on both ends. One to go into this hole that I just drilled, and the other to go into the base itself, so to hold up the uprights. With those drilled out, I went ahead and reassembled everything, put it in place, and you can see our diagonal. We've got a bolt going through the base here. That was the second hole I drilled out. And we're pretty much done. Now to do some finishing. Alright, we took everything apart, and now we're going to do some sanding. Because if we look at the surface, you can see all those router marks, that splinter right there, and more importantly, we're going to see a whole bunch of saw marks on this piece of wood. So let's not be shy about it. Sanding is not anyone's favorite part. Well, maybe there is somebody out there. We're going to go ahead and go from 80 grit to 100 grit and then 150. So let's not delay. Let's go ahead and get started. I put the workpiece down on this pad, and I've got 80 grit sandpaper in my sander. I'm going to go ahead and get some hearing protection. The sander's hooked up to our shop vac. And now as I sand, I work the sander back and forth, but I'm letting the sander do the work. It does everything I need to do. I just have to guide it. Let's sand everything smooth to 80 grit. We'll get out the router with a roundover bit, soften all the edges, and then bring everything together for some more sanding, because you know, sanding is the best way to get to a good finish. After sanding everything to 80 grit, we're going to route the edges. We have a 1/4 inch rounding over bit on my router, and we're going to start on a test piece. Alright, as you can see, rounded over the edges pretty well. That's a little bit of burning that usually happens on the end grain, especially on pine. But we shouldn't have too much of a problem on these pieces. So I'm going to go ahead and start routing all of them. Once they're all routed, we're going to do some additional sanding. With all our pieces sanded to 150 grit, we're going to put in some stain, a red chestnut. Before the stain, we have to wipe everything down, get all the dust off of it. Let me show you how that's done next. And just wrap it up. Take a little bit of this, get this kind of damp. Now, you can use a tack cloth if you want to go out and buy that, but just using a little bit of mineral spirits and a clean shop towel, and a really fancy paper towel, just wipe it down. You'll notice I'm going all in the same direction. That's to capture the dust onto this. I'm just going to flip it over and do the next one. I'm going to go ahead and speed up the video a little bit here. I went ahead and wiped down all of the boards, all of the spacers, and then turned my attention to getting the stain on there. A couple of things about stain. You can use fancy cloths, you can use brushes to lay it on. I just continue to use my shop towels, my paper shop towels. They work great, especially for a small project like this. If we were talking about a finer finish, I might have gone out and used some brushes, or maybe even one of my spray guns. But again, for this kind of project, these are fine. Once I got the stain on the board all together, I go ahead and take a clean cloth and wipe everything down. All of the pieces get done the same way, and they get set out overnight to dry. Start doing some assembly. Got our bolt. It's going to come up this way. Then we're going to put a spacer there. That just lets the leg swivel easier. Then we'll put this washer in that hole, and then we'll put this nut in the hole. Now, the nut has some nylon on it. That nylon keeps it from slipping. It's very important. We don't want this guy slipping around. All right, so let's see what happens. I'll slide the bolt under, and now it's got a square set. Earlier when we pre-assembled before all the staining, and I drove it with the impact driver, that let that square set properly. Now I put the leg in, the bolt is sitting there, I put a washer, and then I put a washer with the nylon on it. Now I'm not going to tighten it all the way yet. I'm going to assemble everything first, and then I'll tighten them all the way. Just as I was filming this, an airplane went overhead. You couldn't hear anything I was saying. I got one sub-assembly for the upright on the left side and the other on the right. I'm going to bring everything together and use one of those bolts to hold the diagonals in place. Persuasion, but I got those bolts in, and here it is, the hammock stand. I hope you enjoyed watching me build this hammock stand, and I'm sure you'll be able to build one at home. The final product had the legs a little shorter. That happened after I sat in it a little while and realized they were a little too long. And I need to do some work on my video editing. Hope you learned something, and who knows what else I'll build in my shop. Take care.